Hi everybody, welcome back to English 116. This is our class for Wednesday, the 6th of November. So I'm sorry I wasn't feeling well on Monday. I hope you received the notice that class was canceled. But we continue on with A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I am continuing on with grading paper number 1. You might have received it back from me. If not, you should shortly. My hope is to finish up all of the papers by next week. And as you know, you all have the option of revising the first paper. So once I've returned it to you, and I graded for grammar and mechanics as well as content, and then I put some summary comments on it and a grade. As long as your grade is lower than an A, you can't get higher than an A, but if it's an A minus or lower, then basically you can rewrite it for a higher grade if you so elect to. Just incorporate my comments, and if you need further direction, just let me know and submit in your revision with the original with my commentary. And I'm well aware that my handwriting leaves something to be desired, so if you can't read my comments, please let me know and I'll be happy to decipher for you. But I ask that you hand in your revision along with the original with my commentary to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, by the last day of class. And you will be doing a sort of similar exercise for paper number 2, the distinction being that your second paper is going to be about drama. So you could write about Oedipus the King, and I'll be distributing those topics, but they're the same as the topics for paper number 1. So you could write about contemporary relevance, you could write about inclusion in the canon, or you can create your own essay topic as long as it's based on one of the dramas we're studying in class and you have it approved by me. So the first paper I see as a kind of learning exercise where you can incorporate those elements into your second paper. So you're just duplicating that. And there won't be time to do a third paper, but by that point in the semester, we will be reading poetry, which means that the focus of our final examination will be poetry. But our final will be open note, open book. So it's not a question of memorization. It's a question of synthesizing what we've been talking about in terms of poetry at that point over the course of the semester. 80 points of the final will be devoted to poetry, which leaves 20 points left over, 10 for short story and 10 for drama. And as you know, this is also a film class, so the films as well as the text will be options for you to talk about. So, we were talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is a notoriously complex play, in part because love is notoriously complex. Midsummer Night's Dream is a comedy, so that means it's about love, all of the difficulties associated with love. There will be humor, and there will be, more importantly, a happy ending, which means marriage or the promise of marriage and no death, with lots of music and dance. And when we think about the play itself, some of the themes in the play is that love makes everyone, regardless of age, regardless of status, an idiot. So there's a lot to be offended about in this play because we're basically all called asses, which I will get to in a moment. And if you think about all of the couplings, we've got a lot of doubling in this play. And all of these couples, which I suggested that you keep a chart of because it's easy to get confused as the couplings change over the course of the drama. We're introduced to Theseus and Hippolyta, and they're a king and a queen. And they obviously are royalty, but they aren't immune to the difficulties of love. We know that Theseus has conquered Hippolyta, who is the queen of the Amazons, and more. So power dynamics are one of the major themes in the drama and how those play out in terms of love. We know that Hippolyta can't be too happy because she's been conquered in war. But we know this is also a comedy, so that at the end, we know that she will probably be, if not happy, at least not unhappy about their union, which was a political union, a kind of social union, and the more common kind of union that would occur at the time. Less about romantic love and more about practical love, getting married for economic reasons or for political reasons. An affection would develop after marriage. And then we know another coupling. We have nobles. So nobles are below king and queen. And also in terms of age, the assumption is that Theseus and Hippolyta are older than the nobles, where we've got Hermia and Lysander, and we've got Demetrius and Helena. And despite the fact that they are nobles or younger, they too have their own problems. And notice different phases of relationship. Theseus and Hippolyta are engaged. And in terms of the nobles, Hermia, Helena, Lysander, and Demetrius, they're dating. And they have their own love problems. Hermia and Lysander have a problem because her father does not approve. Now, this is huge in the time of the Renaissance because a daughter is supposed to obey her father's will. In effect, a daughter would be seen as property of her father. And her father has made a declaration that he would like her to be with Demetrius. More than like, he demands that she be with Demetrius. And she says no, so she defies her father. And in fact, she's going to get her way by the ending of the play, which makes Shakespeare rather subversive. There's social commentary here that we get a strong female character who gets her way. Don't expect anything simple from Shakespeare, however, because we'll have other female characters who don't necessarily get their way. But Hermia dares to defy her father. Now, we know that the situation with Helena and Demetrius is a little bit more complicated. There's some language in the play that I'll be referencing soon to illustrate that they had a relationship prior to the start of the play, but they're no longer together. Basically, Demetrius no longer wants or loves Helena, to illustrate that love is fickle and love is quite temporary. And Helena still wants Demetrius, which is an element of unrequited love. Now, also another element of love. And she continues to pursue him, even though he doesn't want her. And this is the choice that Hermia's father Aegeus has made. He wants Demetrius. And there really is no good reason because Demetrius and Lysander are pretty similar to one another. I had a professor in college say that they're both jerks. It's just a question of which one is the bigger jerk. But their dialogue could even be exchanged for one another. And really what this is again another illustration of power. Um, it's less about having a rationale for wanting his daughter to be with a particular man and more about the very famous, if you've ever heard this term, because I said so, in response to when you ask a question. And it's his will, she dares to defy it. So it isn't that one man is better than another. And of course, Demetrius has to deal with the reality that Helena is still in love with him. Even though he doesn't love her, he loves Hermia. It's bad enough that he no longer loves Helena. It's even worse that he's decided to fall in love with Helena's best friend, who will soon become her former best friend, which shows what love can do. It can destroy friendships. Also interesting in the women, they both have similar names and that they both start with H. Again, very deliberate for Shakespeare to illustrate how easy it is to interchange one lover with another, even though we maintain that our lovers are unique. And also, they have great differences in terms of physicality. Helena is tall and blonde, which would have been considered the epitome of beauty at that time. And yet, Helena doesn't have any male suitors at the beginning of the play. Hermia does. Hermia is the short brunette. And that will lead to tension between them as well. So we've got all of those love difficulties, and then we're introduced to fairies, who perhaps might be the most highly ranked, even above humans, because these are supernatural entities. They have their own love problems. We don't know how old the fairies are. One assumes perhaps they have a good amount of age, because in theory, fairies probably have longer lifespans than humans. But nevertheless, we do know they're in a different stage of relationship. They're married, but they too have problems. Titania and Oberon, the fairies. Oberon is demanding the changeling child, which is a little boy that basically his wife is caring for, that used to belong to one of her serving women who died in childbirth. And Oberon doesn't give a good reason why he wants this child. He just wants it. And again, it's very similar to the answer of because I told you so, when he demands something and there isn't a real good reason for it, because a wife should obey her husband. At least that was the conception during the time period, much like a daughter should obey her father. And Titania dares to say no, to defy basically her husband's will. That's huge. In fact, she's even forsworn their marriage bed, which means she's denying him sexual relations. So we've got a strong woman, just like Hermia, who's defying the male in her life. Thing is, Titania's not going to get her way by the end. In fact, she will be manipulated to fall in love with the literal figurative ass. And because she's distracted, because that's what happens when you're in love, you become distracted. And things that used to matter to you, like changeling boys or children, no longer are that important to you. So Oberon takes a changeling boy. And of course, we know we have to have a happy ending. So this spell will be removed from her eyes, and she's going to forgive and forget, which might seem difficult from a 2024 perception, but it would not have been that unrealistic during the time of the Renaissance for a happy ending, that we're just returning to status quo. So Hermia gets her way. Titania does not get her way. And we know that Hippolyta has been conquered, but it seems that she's developing affection. So who's left? Well, when you think about it, there's Helena. And of course, Helena, in many ways, is quite problematic for a 2024 audience. She says, treat me like your dog. She acts like a stalker, in effect. And she's pursuing a man who doesn't want her. So we could see that as evidence of weakness. But at one point, Helena says, women were not made to woo. And the fact is that she's put in the position of wooer, which she shouldn't do. A woman is supposed to be passive, not active in terms of pursuing love. Not only does Helena act as pursuer, but she gets her way by the ending of the play. Of course, from 2024 standards, this might be problematic. Certainly from Demetrius's perspective, in that he's with her because he's been manipulated through love juice. But again, in Renaissance standards, this would seem as a restoration of order because they did have a relationship prior to the play. So you've got all of these elements going on, and then you've got Bottom, who I wish in the performance that we had seen, they had portrayed him as being unmarried because he's supposed to not be involved in a love relationship. I think that's important because even though he's a bottom, a literal and eventually figurative, or the other way around, a figurative and eventually a literal ass, he comes up with some of the smartest dialogue by the ending of the play. He sees what others don't, that man is but an ass. And of course, there's some joking here. But nevertheless, the other characters don't see how ridiculous they've all been when it's their turn to be involved in a love relationship. So they've learned very little. And if we think about what's left, well, of course, we've got Puck, who happens to be an audience favorite and also an actor favorite. Actors love to play Puck. Puck is mischievous, but not evil. Puck is responsible for perhaps embarrassment and for difficulties in your life, but nothing that's fatal. Puck controls and manipulates the action. In some ways, Puck is like a Shakespeare, controlling and manipulating. And I wonder how much Oberon could do without Puck's help, even though Oberon is supposed to be in a position of power. And of course, Puck is going to help bring about this love juice on the eyes of central characters so that they start falling in and out of love with each other. And the idea that love is like a spell, something that can't be controlled, it's something that's magical. Love is like a dream, hence the title Midsummer Night's Dream. Also, something that can't be controlled, maybe something that's not real. Dreams aren't real. A dream can be wonderful, just like love, or it can be a nightmare, just like love. So you can see how this idea of dreaming and spells is very appropriate in terms of the idea of love. Even look at the language we use when somebody falls in love. When you fall, you can hurt yourself. You can kill yourself. It can be embarrassing. It's something you try to avoid. It's something out of your control. None of these are positives that are considered with the word fall, which is what we use when we say when somebody falls in love. So yes, love is like a dream. Love is like a spell. Love destroys friendships. We see it with Hermia and Helena. Beauty doesn't have to be tall and blonde. It can be the short brunette, which would have seemed radical at the time. Virginity is so incredibly important during this time period, especially for female. Now, that's not to say that necessarily people live by those standards. Shakespeare himself, 6 months after he was married, had his first child. So do the math. But the idea is that a woman would be viewed as damaged goods if she was not virginal. So this is constantly the tension that's in the play. These women have to be virginal if they're not married. And there's tension, of course, for them to lose their virginity if for no other reason the play is happening in midsummer, which is a pagan holiday that's one of the most sexually charged days of the year. Midsummer is the equinox. And the way it's celebrated is through fertility rites, basically through sexual union. And there's also reference to May Day at the ending of the play, and May Day is also another pagan holiday, very much associated with fertility and sexual rights. So again, to set this play on 2 days, or reference to one and setting the play in another, that are associated with fertility, to set this play at night. Notice how we transition from daytime, that's reason, rationality, to nighttime, where things are unknown, wilderness. Think about the Untamed, Young Goodman Brown, if you will, if you want to think about the fiction section. How we move from Athens, which is the city that's supposed to represent order and civilization, and we go to the wilderness, that which is wild and untamed. And of course, Shakespeare is going to have to use some plot devices to get most of the major characters into the wilderness, which he's able to do. So, in terms of the writing, that too has a certain level of sophistication to it. You might have noticed in the production that we saw all of the rhyme that can occur in the dialogue. And the idea behind rhyme is that the higher level characters would be speaking in rhyme. That was considered to be a more superior language. Lower level characters would speak in sentences. But Shakespeare was subversive about that too. He would have lower characters speaking in rhyme, showing that you don't have to have a lot of education or a lot of status to have intelligence. And the other way around too. He'd have the higher level characters, sometimes even royalty, speak in complete sentences to show that they've descended. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about Shakespeare's poetry, but he oftentimes wrote in iambic pentameter, which is a 10-syllable line that sounds like ba-bum, 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 like a heartbeat, actually, a stressed and unstressed syllable. And what we've got is basically language that mimics perhaps the first sound we've ever heard, our mother's heartbeat when we were in the womb. So it's one of the reasons why the language can be so appealing to the ear. And think about perhaps one of Shakespeare's most famous lines from his poem, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? That's 10 syllables. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? That's no mistake. It's done very deliberately. Not that everything rhymes in Shakespeare's plays, not that everything has iambic pentameter, but a lot of it does. And there's also a lot of symbolism in Shakespeare's plays too. We've been talking about symbolism throughout the fiction section and Oedipus the King as well. And as I was indicating, the difference between verse, poetry, and prose, complete sentences. So you've got the themes to consider, you've got the writing to consider, and you've got the quotes, because Shakespeare is a master of language. And I just wanted to draw some of them to your attention. In the first act, expect Shakespeare to use some witty language. I've seen Midsummer performed in a lot of different ways, and if this line is delivered correctly, it can be quite humorous. When Lysander says to Demetrius, "You have her father's love, Demetrius. Now let me have Hermia's." Act 1, Scene 1, line 93 through 94. And note, when I'm quoting, I am not referencing page numbers. This is one of the ways that Shakespeare is actually easier than other texts. Because usually when we quote, we reference page numbers, which can be problematic if we're using different editions. They have different page numbers. Shakespeare's plays very nicely are divided into act, scene, and line. So regardless of which edition or version we're using, we can all turn to Act 1, Scene 1, 93 through 94. And this is how we quote from Shakespeare. If you did decide to write your paper about Shakespeare, you wouldn't put a page number in the parenthetical documentation. You'd write act, scene, and line. You'd use a capital Roman numeral for the act, and then a period, a lowercase Roman numeral for the scene, and then a period, and then the Arabic, which would be like 93, or in the instance I'm giving you 93-94 because it's 2 lines. History. So this is where we get some backstory in Act 1. And remember the point of Act 1, which is basically just to introduce us to characters and plot, where Lysander said that Demetrius has made love to Neater's daughter, Helena. So this is Helena's father. Notice he doesn't appear in the play, which is probably why Helena has a certain amount of freedom that Hermia may not have. When he says made love to Neater's daughter, Helena, he doesn't mean sexual relations. He talks about wooing her. Again, it's important that she be a virgin for us to have our happy ending. And this is the backstory that Helena and Demetrius were a couple, but he's changed his mind because love is a fickle thing. Lysander at one point says, and this is a very famous line, the course of true love never did run smooth. So one of the morals of the play, that love is difficult and it can have rough times associated with it. Shakespeare loves to show off how good he is by showing how bad other people can be, his competition, which is one of the reasons why we have the whole 5th act, Pyramus and Thisbe, the play within a play, to show us what a bad play looks like, which is Pyramus and Thisbe. But we see it even in the 1st act, where we've got an example of good rhyme said by one of the characters, Hermia, for instance, and bad rhyme said shortly thereafter by another character, Bottom. And the good rhyme, notice how the rhyme helps to forward plot. It's not just there simply to rhyme. It's there in terms of moving the plot forward as well. And Hermia says in Act 1, Scene 1, line 202 to 207, take comfort, he no more shall see my face. Lysander and myself will fly this place. Before the time I did Lysander see, seemed Athens as a paradise to me. Oh, then what graces in my love do dwell, that he hath turned to heaven unto a hell. So notice face, place, see, me, dwell, hell. So these are the last words of each line. Now, bad rhyme, where you have something that rhymes purely because you need it to rhyme, but it's really not saying anything at all. In fact, it's very trite, cliche, and sing-songy. This is what we get with Bottom as he's rehearsing when he says, the raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far and make and mar the foolish fates. And that in Act 1, Scene 2, line 31 to 38 is finished off with Bottom saying that was lofty. In other words, he's complimenting himself on something that's well done, but it's not well done. It reminds me of the children's poem, roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. It rhymes, but it doesn't make it a complex or interesting poem. So if we were to move to the 2nd act, where we're getting the building of tension, power dynamics, as I was referencing earlier, where Titania refuses to give over the changeling boy, even though she's supposed to follow her husband's will. And she says, I have forsworn his bed and company. Act 2, Scene 1, line 63. Again, using sex as a power weapon. Sometimes you'll have some odd dialogue by characters. For instance, in the 2nd act, 1st scene, line 186, Oberon the fairy at one point says, I am invisible. This is a cue for us as audience to know that he's invisible. They didn't have CGI or special effects artists back then. We think, though, that there were special costumes they might have wore that would denote invisibility. But this is for us to understand that he's invisible, so when other characters are on the stage, they can't see him. Though, of course, they can see him because he's really there, but we have to suspend disbelief. Threats. Demetrius, as Helena is following him, says, oh, if thou follow me, but I shall do thee mischief in the wood. Act 2, Scene 1, line 236 to 237, where basically he's telling her, if you continue to follow me, I'm going to take your virginity, whether you give it to me or not. So this is a threat. And getting them into the woods, it shows how irrational love is. Because when we have Hermia and Lysander, they do what perhaps most young couples would do when they're denied to have their love. They run away, and they run away into the woods. And Hermia, not thinking very clearly, tells her best friend, Helena, what the plan is, that they're running away to the woods. And Helena, whose thinking is even more unclear, comes up with this convoluted reasoning that if I tell Demetrius that Hermia's run away, well, then he'll love me. Of course, that's not what happens. When Demetrius finds out, he decides to chase after Hermia, which means that Helena needs to chase after him, which gets all the characters into the woods, which is good, so there's a plot device here. But it shows how irrational love can be, because none of this makes sense. And as I was indicating earlier in the second act, when Helena, even though she wants to be treated like a dog, she says that your wrongs do set a scandal on my sex. We cannot fight for love as men may do. We would be wooed, and we're not made to woo. Guess if we see any strength in Helena is that she takes the active role of pursuer and gets his way. Hermia also has to protect her own virginity. Notice that Lysander keeps wanting to lie near her, even though he says it's perfectly innocent, even though it's happening during midsummer, even though it's nighttime, even though they're in the woods. And she says in Act 2, Scene 2, line 57, for love and courtesy lie further off, and humane modesty. So Act 3, this is going to be the height of tension in the play. So, and we also get some morals from, of all people, Bottom, who says in Act 3, Scene 2, line 143 and 144, reason and love keep little company nowadays. Again, it's very hard to illustrate reason or rationality when you're in love. Puck is a great audience favorite. And he's supposed to be serving Oberon, but the reality is that Puck is controlling and manipulating action, almost like Shakespeare. I wonder what would happen if Oberon didn't have Puck to do these things. Puck says, what fools these mortals be. And oh yeah, they are all foolish when it comes to love. But I would argue it's more than just the mortals, because even the fairies are acting like fools in love. Even though Titania is under the love juice, but she falls in love with Bottom, who is an ass, but Puck decides on his own, because Puck is mischievous, to turn him into a literal ass. An ass, by the way, would have been known as the most well-endowed creature in the animal kingdom. So there's some sexual jokes that are going on here about her being with an ass. The assumption is they consummate their relationship. And that said, we can think about Shakespeare being subversive. The idea of a fairy with an animal, that's almost like a human with an animal. And, that gets into elements of bestiality that is something we wouldn't discuss in the K through 12 level. But all of a sudden, Shakespeare is sort of delving into some taboo subjects. And that said, when we get all of this, we get insults that are fast and furious in Act 3. If this were a tragedy, these lovers would come to blows and would actually kill one another. Because Puck is given instructions that, he is, in addition to putting the love juice into Titania's eyes, so that she becomes distracted, so that Oberon can take the changeling boy. Oberon decides to intervene. He sees Helena, feels a certain level of empathy, sympathy, pity for her, and instructs Puck, go put the love juice in the Athenian man's eyes, the man wearing the Athenian garb. This is where you can have so much fun with Puck if you're playing him as an actor, because you can make it appear very deliberate that Puck misunderstands, and he knows he's supposed to put the love juice in Demetrius's eyes, but he puts it in Lysander's because they're both wearing Athenian garb, just for his amusement and entertainment, just to see the havoc that results. Or you can play Puck as an innocent. He's just following orders. He found a man wearing Athenian garb, put the love juice on his eyes, and oops, it was the wrong man. Regardless, this leads to all kinds of misunderstandings. And when Puck and Oberon rectify this error by putting the love juice on the right man's eyes, Demetrius, the love juice is never taken off of Lysander's eyes. So now we have the exact opposite of what the play began with. The play began with two men in love with Hermia, the short brunette no less. Now we have two men in love with Helena, the tall blonde. And what this is going to mean for these two women who were the best of friends, they will become the best of enemies, which shows what love can do. And the insults will fly fast and furious when Helena is insulted by, or gives an insult to Hermia by calling Hermia a puppet. A puppet is small, so Hermia is tiny as well. A puppet is manipulated by others. So basically, Helena is saying that Hermia is manipulated by others. Hermia responds with her own insults. You painted maypole. And a maypole, during the time of May Day, and I don't know if elementary schools still celebrate May Day, where kids dance around the maypole. They don't even realize what they're doing if they're still doing this in schools. The maypole is a phallic symbol, and by dancing around it, you're supposed to celebrate fertility. Basically, the maypole's a penis. So Hermia has just called her former best friend a penis and called her a painted maypole, which means she's wearing makeup, which means she's a strumpet, which means she's a harlot. And note how quickly love can turn to hate, where these men who once swore their love to Hermia are now swearing their hatred for Hermia. Hermia is told, away, you Ethiop, in reference to Ethiopia. Her dark features, not necessarily dark skin, but dark hair and eyes. And Lysander's first go-to, remember, he used to love Hermia. His first go-to in Act 3, Scene 2, line 268 is, should I hurt her? Strike her? Kill her dead? So maybe I should hurt her, maybe I should hit her, maybe I should kill her. Oh, I guess not. And Lysander continues insulting Hermia by saying, get you gone, you dwarf. Again, this is another insult about height, or really lack of height. You minimus, again, something small. You bead, you acorn, again, small. So these are height jokes. Act 3, Scene 2, line 327 or 329. But we know that we're reading and watching a comedy, which means there has to be a happy resolution. And it seems like the resolution happens in Act 4, because if we go back to the beginning of the play, you'll remember that Hermia's father, Aegeus, is just so frustrated that his daughter won't listen to him, even though she's supposed to. He goes to the highest law of the land, the king, King Theseus, and tells the king, tell my daughter to listen to me. And Theseus says so. You listen to your father, and if you don't, the consequences are dire. You will either be sent to a nunnery or you will be killed. And of course, Hermia responds by running away at that point, because Theseus gives her some time to think about it. And if you want to consider this is actually quite clever on Shakespeare's point, or Shakespeare's part, I should say, because it is a plot device. It gives her enough time to run away in the woods. But it also, I think, is very clever to illustrate that political leaders, such as Theseus, they don't want to make decisions because they're going to anger somebody. So the longer they can postpone making a decision, the better off they are, especially because things might change in the future or they might not be as heated. So giving Hermia time to think about it is to his advantage. And after all, he's busy with his own love problems. He's got a Hippolyta that he conquered in war, and she's not too happy about it. So he can focus on his own love life rather than having to focus on ruling the kingdom and telling Hermia what to do. So, but in Act 4, we need to return to that. And now that the love juice has been removed from Lysander's eyes, so now Lysander is back in love with Hermia. And I know this is hard for 2024 sensibilities that Hermia would take him back after he's been so horrific. But this is considered to be a reestablishment of order. That Theseus needs to make a decision about what to do with Hermia. And Theseus takes basically the best of all possible worlds. The four lovers are content with one another. Hermia's with Lysander and Lysander's with Hermia. They're happy. Helena's with Demetrius. Demetrius is with Helena. And they're happy. And again, we have to perhaps suspend a little bit disbelief that the women would be so willing to have these men after they've been so humiliated and insulted. And we have to deal with the problematic issue of how Demetrius is being manipulated to love Helena through love juice. But again, if we want to see this in the Renaissance perspective of the restoration of order, that he had committed himself to Helena prior to the play, so this is just the way things should be. I guess this is as happy of an ending as we're going to get. You've got the four people who are nobles, they're all content. It's just Aegeus, the dad, who's unhappy. So this is as good as it's going to get for Theseus. So this is how he rules, that he will overbear Aegeus's will. And this is where Bonham declares in Act 4, Scene 1, line 206, man is but an ass. Which, of course, is funny because he had been turned into a literal donkey for Puck's amusement. But man is indeed an ass. And if anybody watching this play is offended, and by this point just about everybody should be offended, it makes good sense for Shakespeare to try to mend some bridges and make some apologies, especially if the Queen is offended. After all, the Queen has a lot of political power and she loved plays, so she was likely to be here. So a statement that seems to be meaningless is actually quite meaningful. When you have Hippolyta and you have Theseus speaking with one another, and Theseus says in Act 4, Scene 1, line 93, where I've come, great clerks have proposed to greet me with premeditated welcomes, shiver and look pale. In conclusion, dumbly broken off. Yet I picked a welcome. In other words, I've had some subjects who have been so nervous about greeting me that they haven't given me a greeting or they've given me a poor greeting. I don't see that as offensive. I see that as a compliment that they think so highly of me that they would be nervous. The idea is the Queen would be watching this, hear that, and think of herself and think, I'm that generous, I'm that magnanimous, I'm that kind as well to my own subjects. Even though they may not greet me properly, I understand it's because of nervousness, not out of disrespect. The play could end here, but it's important that we have the fifth act for the play within a play, Pyramus and Thisbe, which mirrors what we've just seen. It's about love relationships and their complexities, except Pyramus and Thisbe ends badly with death. And if Pyramus and Thisbe reminds you of something like Romeo and Juliet, it's supposed to. It's thought that Romeo and Juliet came out around the same time as A Midsummer Night's Dream. Remember, we're not exactly sure of dates. We've got circa next to the dates. But either we've already seen Romeo and Juliet, a great play, and we can compare it to Pyramus and Thisbe, a lousy play. Or this is great advertising, that Shakespeare has a new play coming out called Romeo and Juliet, and it'll be much better than Pyramus and Thisbe, which has bad acting and has bad rhyme and thinks so little of the audience that everything has to be said. It's got to be as literal as possible. So we've got to tell the audience this is not a real lion, this is an actor playing a lion, so they aren't afraid. Or if we've got a wall in the play, an actor's got to play the wall because we can't suspend our disbelief. So this is a wonderful opportunity for Shakespeare to mock his competition and show us what other playwrights are doing, that they're doing things like Pyramus and Thisbe, bad writing and bad acting. We can spend our time and our money watching those, or we can spend our time and money watching something good by William Shakespeare. So it's a way to critique. And it also is a wonderful opportunity to show the lack of insight, the lack of learning that's gone on with all of these characters. Hippolyta at one point says, as she's watching the play, this is the silliest stuff I ever heard. And it is silly and absurd. And everybody's laughing. Never once do they stop to think that they themselves had been equally ridiculous and absurd, except they'd done it for real. But the real lesson is for us, you, me, us, because these are all actors in a play. They get paid to pretend. But if we're watching A Midsummer Night's Dream for entertainment and we laugh at Pyramus and Thisbe, and we never once saw how equally ridiculous we perhaps have been in the past in love, or will be in the future, then Shakespeare's saying you've learned nothing at all. That this is really timeless and universal. So it makes sense that we get another apology, and perhaps one of the most famous speeches by Puck. If we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended. that you have but slumbered here, and no more yielding but a dream. Don't take this so seriously. It's not real. It's play acting. It's like a dream. But of course, Puck says, if I am an honest Puck. And the thing is, Puck's not honest. He's a liar. So already this is a backhanded apology. And he talks about how they want to escape the serpent's tongue, which is a hiss for booing and hissing in the audience. Sss, that they don't want negative reviews from the audience. Instead, he asks for their hands. Give me your hands, which is applause. And good night unto you all. This is his way of saying the play is over. And please applaud and don't boo and don't hiss. And again, he says, and if this isn't true, else the Puck a liar called. But Puck is a liar, so he's just negated everything that he has said about being apologetic and that this wasn't real. And if we shadows have offended, typical Shakespeare. Especially if Puck is a stand-in for Shakespeare himself at the ending of the play, apologizing for things as he controls and manipulates action. And don't think that Shakespeare isn't above a sex joke when it comes to Pyramus and Thisbe. So I don't take credit nor blame for this, where I had a professor who talked about when Thisbe was speaking in Act 5, Scene 1, line 190. So I still remember this very clearly when I was in college. Talking about Thisbe saying, my cherry lips have often kissed thy stones with lime and hair. Makes perfect sense because you've got basically a wall between two lovers. Or what you can say is that this is a reference to oral sex. My cherry lips have often kissed thy stones being testicles, thy stones with lime and hair being pubic hair, basically knit up in thee. So again, I don't take credit, nor do I take blame. So in terms of today's attendance question, which would be due Friday the 8th, there's a lot of surprising things about A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I'm curious to know, what did you find to be the most surprising thing about the play? Or one of the most surprising things about the play? And why? Again, no right or wrong answer. That'll be due on Friday the 8th. Certainly you can ask for an extension if you'd like. And I am catching up with my grading of the discussion forum questions as well as your paper. Hopefully I will be all caught up by next week. And next class, do keep in mind that on Monday, we do not have class. That's Veterans Day, which I will remind you of by posting that on Moodle. And then as we transition away from Shakespeare, we go into our last play of the semester, which is A Raisin in the Sun. Keep in mind it wasn't included in our textbook, but I had ordered it as a separate text and luckily was able to find it as a free link online that you can reference. Again, we'll watch performance and talk about performance in addition to the play, which is where we'll pick up next class. So I'll just leave you with, if you look at the notes below, I've got an advertisement for, see, I'm not above advertising myself, just like Shakespeare. CMN 201, the horror film and media and popular culture. So what we were doing with analysis with short story and film and drama, you can actually do with popular culture, such as horror film. And I'm a great fan of horror film. That the history of horror film is essentially a history of anxiety. And we watch and discuss that in the following films, and each film represents a decade. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Dracula, Cat People, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Psycho, and The Living Dead both represent the 1960s, so I cheat a little bit there. The Exorcist, Halloween, The Blair Witch Project, 28 Days Later, and Get Out. So if you want to know more about the class, please let me know. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. We'll put some closure onto Shakespeare, and we will begin talking about A Raisin in the Sun. Take care. Bye-bye.